It's always a great time when you sit down with people who write stories and share their story. Arrow.net, ARROE.net. We are unplugged and totally uncut with Michael Smith and Jonathan Franklin. Wow, I can't imagine you guys waking up in March of 2020 or even April of 2020 on a ship, and here's this pandemic that's taking place and you're stuck on it.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable to imagine, even after writing the whole book about it, just the levels of emotion, raw emotions, fear, just sort of not knowing what's really going on and just sitting there like a victim, and you can't do anything about it.
In a situation like that, the first thing I would do is go into meditation. What did you guys do?
Really just tried to figure out, get inside the heads of the people aboard the ship, and both the crew and the passengers. And one of the first things we did was really start to figure out, who was the first-hand testimonies who can tell us, what it was really like to be stuck at sea.
Yeah. What we're talking about here for listeners is cabin fever. And literally you guys had cabin fever. You were stuck in that cabin. You couldn't be running around, playing around on a cruise ship.
Well, that's true. So the book is about this particular voyage, which is really emblematic of what we all went through during the pandemic at the very beginning. That was the period where you're sort of worried about, getting COVID from your groceries and, rubbing them with disinfectant. Yeah. And so we tried to understand what it would have been like to go through the pandemic, but being stuck in a cruise ship with no access to the outside world, because we actually were not on the cruise ship. So we had to sort of recreate that whole scene.
But see, that's the part I love about being a writer or a journalist, is the way that, you take other people's stories and you put realization into it. Because that's one of my struggles that I've been with people is that, there's going to come a time where people aren't going to believe that this pandemic took place, but they need writers like yourself in order to make sure that we've got something that we can go back to.
Yeah, it was really important to us to try and capture that moment, because it really was insane. You'll see scenes in our book where people are scrubbing forks and scrubbing knives and looking at the vents inside these tiny little rooms, wondering, did COVID come in under the door? Is it coming through the vent? Can it live for 2 days, 2 weeks? There was so much, it wasn't even misinformation or disinformation, it was just flat out ignorance.
What was the one thing that you personally learned from having these conversations? Or was it all the same tune, or did people have just a different journey?
Yeah. So as Jonathan was saying, we tried to really get inside people's heads by talking to as many folks who were there as possible. And what I learned is that everyone sort of had to find their own way to deal with it. And some people really almost lost their minds. Others were just incredibly heroic and just wanted to help sort of their fellow man, strangers they didn't even know. And many took grave risks to do that. So in a way, it sort of restored my faith in humanity, to sort of be a cliche, because a lot of people just soldiered through it and found a way to survive and found a way to help as many people as they could in the process.
How did people get their information? Was it through the internet, or did the ship's captain, make sure that people were up to date?
One of the remarkable things about the saga of the cruise ship Zaandam is that their captain, Ann Smith, was brilliant at being a leader, and could almost be studied as a case study in how you manage panic and anxiety aboard a closed system. And what the captain did is he would give people very regular briefings, and he wouldn't hide things. Passengers died. There was one 3-day period. 1 day period where 3 people died, and he kept people informed, which was key. And of course, the passengers had massive amounts of access to Wi-Fi, so they were setting up Facebook groups, and one of the first things they did is set up a group called Zaandam Prisoners.
I remember those stories vividly of cruise ships that could not dock at ports because they just didn't want to deal with it. I just can't imagine how people kept sane.
Yeah, as Jonathan was saying, there was information internally that got to people, but the sort of the desperation just kept building and building as the ship went from one port to another, or tried to go from one port to another and was refused. And at the same time, the whole world was shutting down. And of course, the passengers found out about that via internet and via the captain. So it really felt like, I think, to a lot of people, that they were utterly alone in the world, in the middle of the ocean, on a ship, and nobody was going to really help them. They had to basically help themselves.
Now, one of the things that instantly grabs my attention, and maybe it's just my connection to Hollywood, but I mean, if I were on the ship and we were out there all by ourselves, at that point in time, I would start shaping a government on board that ship. Did anything like that happen?
Well, I think the captain was the president,
Yeah.
By leading by example, and he has a chain of command. Every ship does, and I think he managed that pretty well. You're right. There wasn't a mutiny. People didn't freak out to the point where they violated that chain of command. So they kind of respected the way a ship should be run, which is like a country, and it is a country actually because it's in the middle of international waters.
So when you sat down and had these conversations, did anyone on board just accept the fact that, this could be it? Because I know that my wife and I had those conversations that, if one of us gets it, what is the next step?
For sure. Michael and I spoke to many passengers and many crew, and you have to remember this is an average age of about 70, probably lots of 75-year-olds. This was quite an elderly passenger group. So it was the conversations about maybe we both die, maybe you live, maybe I live was very frequent. We have, there's even cases of both husband and wife both ending up on respirators, next to each other in ICU units. So it was, there was nothing hypothetical about the shadow of death.
Wow, that you basically described what happened to my family. My mother, my sister, and my brother were all on those respirators at the same time in a hospital. I can so relate with that, but keeping calm though for outsiders is. Did you talk with anybody who associated? In other words, family members who were on shore?
In fact, the way that this is Mike, and I my day job is with Bloomberg News as a journalist, and I got into this by actually covering this actual cruise as it was unfolding, and that turned into a pretty long feature for Businessweek magazine, which ended up turning into the book. And especially in the beginning, the way I sort of found passengers was through their relatives, through their loved ones at home. Wow. Who were just worried, sick, really just going out of their minds, trying to figure out a way to get their parents, their grandparents, their kids back to dry land. And they reached I think maybe they even reached a level of desperation greater than the people on board.
One of the things that we never think about, the crew. I mean, it's like, we go see a rock concert, we see the band, but we don't see the roadies. I mean, you've got to have the crew on that ship.
Exactly. And I think the example that you gave of roadies is perfect. I mean, they actually have a roadie crew on this ship, and they're all Filipinos. And these guys are like doing spotlights in the high seas, and they're changing the cello band to the magician stand in 10 minutes. I mean, this is one big stage, and, there's a lot of stagehands that are below the waterline. So I think one of the things that Mike and I really wanted to bring forward with this book is just the basic injustice. There's not that much of a difference between a modern cruise ship in some ways and like the social standings aboard the Titanic. They don't lock the people below the waterline, but it's a rough life if you're working in the hold with these big cruise ships, a laundry room, the kitchen staff, and that the normal workload just doubled because they had to do room service for 2,000 people. So think about that. Wow. 6,000 meals a day you have to deliver. I mean, people were literally falling on the floor. The waiters would literally collapse. They just couldn't walk anymore. They would collapse, or they would find the waiters hiding, curled up in balls, hiding under blankets and stuff because they couldn't walk anymore.
Wow. At any time when you were doing your research, did anybody ever bring up the Titanic because it's such a Titanic moment?
Yeah, there was some talk of that, I guess. But getting back to what Jonathan just said about the crew, we really wanted to tell this story from their perspective as much as the passengers or more, because you have to understand people that, most folks that work on ship are making, maybe $2,000 a month, maybe a little bit more if they're lucky after years of experience. And they, they were really risking their lives to keep the passengers alive, who basically look like their grandparents. And, it's just really a heroic story. And a lot of crew members got really, really sick. and there just wasn't enough medical care for everybody. And so they really suffered. And by the way, once the ship did make it to shore, the crew members were stuck on the ship still. They only let passengers off, and some of them were on for months before they could be taken home on ships to their side of the world, basically. So
I was going to ask you about. I was going to ask you about that quarantine period, because wasn't it 14 days that they had to stay on those ships, even though they did dock?
Well, what happens is the CDC is making decisions on the fly. And one of the decisions the CDC makes around in April of 2020 is that crew aboard cruise ships are just too dangerous. They're too risky. They might be infected. So they're not allowed to get off. And so even if you're an American, you were in Fort Lauderdale and all the passengers walked off or were taken off on stretchers, and then they went back to sea. And week after week, these people are doing what they call donut patterns, going around and around in the Bahamas. And part of our book is to, the idea of when you read Cabin Fever is that you feel like you're stuck there with the crew, going around and around. Paradise is right there, but in a lot of ways, Cabin Fever is a survival at sea story. And as Mike said earlier, a lot of us took this journey. And so kind of the whole point of us writing this book was to use a cruise ship to illustrate just kind of the intense stress and anxiety we all went through.
Well, I can't imagine the mental health situations that they're currently going through even today, because, to be out there trapped, and especially, we as human beings, we enjoy our freedoms, but they did not.
Yeah, that's a very good point. A lot of people basically have PTSD to this day. One of the characters we profile in the book, she's from Argentina, and she was probably, as a passenger, stuck on that boat longer than anybody because her country would not let people fly in, even if they were Argentines. So she was stuck on the ship for weeks and weeks and weeks after the cruise ended. And, she got to the point where she couldn't even look at the ocean anymore when she got home, and she happens to live on the ocean. And to this day, she still has psychological issues that she's dealing with because of that sort of desperate sense of never being able to get off that ship ever.
Did they fear the future in the way that, and I'm only bringing this up because it's the big headlines today, is that when the president of the United States says we're getting ready for the second pandemic, here we go again, but what are we going to do to prepare the ships so they're not running out to sea and getting stuck out there again?
Well, the whole future of the cruise industry really is up in the air in all sorts of ways, because we've seen amazingly strict protocols on ships, and then people still getting stuck. And you could definitely face a similar situation where a very infected ship all of a sudden is looked at by the world as some sort of infectious bug. I do think that there's going to be a real wholesale rethinking of cruising, and there's millions of loyal people who are still going to cruise, and there's millions of people considering it, and there's millions who'll never do it. But it's going to be a real challenge for both travelers and for industry to figure out where's the common sense line. And cruise ship is kind of like a prison. There's a lot of vectors.
So have you guys been on a cruise ship since the pandemic? And the reason why I bring that up is because I'm at a movie premiere and I can see what the pandemic has done to movie theaters. It's changed everything on ground. What has it done on the cruise ship? Have you seen anything like that?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. I've never been on a cruise ship in my life, but I have an 8-year-old daughter who's sitting here watching us. And we're going to take her on a cruise ship in August on a Disney cruise for the first time, because it was never really my kind of thing, the way to travel. But I sort of developed a fascination. And so I was writing this book. I was like, we really, really wished we could be on the Zaandam, but unfortunately it hasn't gone back to sea. So I just decided, it's something I want to try. I want to do. I put my life into that world sort of virtually for such a long time that I'm just going to go for it. But I am aware of the risks. And, I think, they have changed a lot of things to make cruises safer, starting with people have to be actually vaccinated against COVID. There's testing protocols when they need them. But like Jonathan said, cruise ships are the perfect storm, so to speak, for any kind of communicable disease. Once it gets on board, it's really, really hard to stop, just because of the nature of ships being cramped quarters everywhere. So it's a risk, but like Jonathan said, it is a huge market, and there's just this incredible human fascination with ships, and especially being in these luxurious environments on the seas, that people are just going to keep doing it until they can't anymore.
I'm a writer. I know how emotional we get when it comes to writing and how much we get into the story. I have to ask you two, with all this research and with all these connections with people who actually went through it, how are you doing mentally?
For me, it was very interesting that you asked that question because my daughter was working in an ICU unit for COVID the whole time during the pandemic. So in certain ways, for me, this book was an ode to my daughter because she graduated from college and like literally the next day went into an ICU unit. So I think that it's always good to have a mission. Like when people are in stressful situations or extreme survival situations, the people who do the best are the doctors, the nurses, somebody who has to care for other people. So in a certain way, this was very cathartic for us because we were able to show survival, and we're trying to promote some of the best characteristics that flourish during a pandemic. So I think that there's a lot of positive messages that can come out with dealing with survival. So I think in a certain way, for us to have allowed people to show us in what ways maybe they become better people, in what ways they've transformed after this. One of the mysteries of, pandemia, apart from the fact it's been a century since, the world's gone through this, is, how we will come out mentally. And cabin fever is not the answer by any stretch of the imagination, but cabin fever does allow you to get inside the heads and kind of look for collective solutions. So I personally feel grateful that even if I hadn't gotten paid a penny, writing the book itself was a very positive process.
Well, to me, vicariously, we're going to live through those people because we all have our own separate stories and things like that. But through the two of you, there's such a connection here because, it's what life was going on, what was taking place beyond us. And it's mentally, I think it's going to help even readers.
Yeah, I really hope so. I like Jonathan said, I really developed a really close bond to some of the folks that we talked to and were in our book. And I really feel like I really came to get sort of emotionally, I had a lot of empathy for what they were going through, and just the raw honesty that they described all that and opened up their lives to me, and this horror, these traumas that they went through. And there's some really, really sad stories as well. But one thing that really made me feel better about it was, almost every single person that survived that journey really sort of found a sort of a new lease on life, sort of redemption in a lot of ways, and decided that it's time to make a change. It's time to really just focus on what's important, and because life is too short. And I found that quite refreshing.
Wow. You guys have got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you. I love the way you guys write. I love the way you guys share the journey. And I know there's going to be many more stories with the two of you in the future.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, you guys be brilliant today, okay?
All right. You too.